Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. It is time today for another Q&A video. If you haven't seen these before, the way it works is once a month I put up a request for questions to my very cool supporters on Patreon. Thank you guys, you are a big part of what allows me to keep doing this on a regular basis. And take the questions that you guys there submit, and I go through them and pull out the best ones, or the ones I can answer the best, and go ahead and answer them for you. So I got a ton of questions this time, way more than I could actually answer all of, so if I don't get to yours, I apologize. If you really want to hear an answer, ask me again next month, and if you pester me enough with it, I will eventually put it in the program. So let's get right into it. We're going to start today with a question from Jeremy Rumbaugh, who says, where does the change occur from bore diameter to length? For example, a 50 BMG refers to the bore diameter of the projectile, whereas, say, a Mark 7 16-inch/50, the 50 refers to the barrel being 50 times the bore diameter. What Jeremy is referring to here is a difference in how barrels are measured between firearms and artillery, or guns and cannons. The cutoff point where something becomes a cannon or a piece of artillery is kind of arbitrarily set at 20 millimeter. So if you have a 50 caliber machine gun, that's a machine gun, it's a small arm or a light weapon. If you have a 20 millimeter gun, that's considered a cannon. So a couple things happen here. One of them is the way the barrel is described. On a 50 caliber machine gun or rifle, you're going to describe the barrel simply as whatever its length is in inches or centimeters. However, when you get to cannons, and this happens with little 20 millimeter cannons, but it's more common in much larger guns, all the way up to 16-inch naval guns. They actually describe the length of the barrel in terms of how many diameters long it is. So let's just say hypothetically you had a 10-inch in diameter bore, a 10-inch naval gun, and the barrel was 100 inches long. That would be described as a 10-inch/10 caliber gun, where the barrel is 10 inches in diameter, and then you've got 10 of those units, so 10 times 10 being 100 inches long. That's the length of your barrel. Now you'll often see this, like if you're into armored vehicles, you'll see it describing tank armament, where something will be a 75 millimeter L20, or L16, or L50. Those are all describing how long the barrel is, and the different length of barrel does have an impact on projectile velocity, so it does become important there. And it's simply a type of nomenclature that isn't used on guns that are small enough to not be considered cannons. So again, the cutoff point there is 20 millimeter, and that's the two different systems that you get. Next up, Gorkin Kurishepi. I may not have gotten that right, I don't know. Anyway, asks, what are your thoughts on the XM8? Did it fail trials because it wasn't different enough, not robust enough? Was it poorly designed? How come it didn't hit the civilian markets like a lot of other failed military rifles did? It struck me as an excellent modern rifle, but the US Army didn't much care for it. Well, I'll give you the quick rundown on it. Actually, I will give a shout out to the blogger Weapons Man, who actually has a really good overview article of the whole program that the XM8 came out of. If you're interested in the subject, I would recommend checking out his article for more detail. Basically, the XM8 was an offshoot of the objective infantry combat weapon, which the objective system was a plan that came up in the 1980s, 1990s, where the military wanted to reduce the number of weapons in the field, or the number of types of weapon. They figured if we can economize and combine a number of different existing guns into a smaller number of guns, things will be better. How exactly is, well, I guess logistics, but it was kind of one of these step one, develop new guns, step three, it's better kind of things. Now specifically what they wanted to do was take 8 existing different classes of firearm and turn them into 3. So they were going to take the M4, the M16, the M203 grenade launcher. These are all going to become the objective infantry combat weapon. They were going to then take the M60, the M2, the Mark 19 grenade launcher, the 240, and I think the 249, and combine them all into the objective crew-served weapon, and then they were going to take the M24 sniper rifle and replace it with the objective sniper weapon, or objective precision weapon. I don't remember the exact terminology. So there were a couple problems with this whole system. The first one was, if you're trying to do this, you probably don't really understand what the actual tactical purposes of all these specific guns are. For example, if you think you can combine the M2 heavy machine gun, the Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher, and, say, the M240 medium machine gun into a single weapon and have it do just as well in all uses as those three, you're wrong. There are places where the Mark 19 grenade launcher is going to do something totally different than an M240 machine gun, and you can't really have one gun do both jobs equally well. So that was the first problem, is conceptually this wasn't a very well thought out program. The second problem was the guns that they came up with to be these objective combat weapons weren't actually any better than the guns they were supposed to be replacing. Now this is where we get towards the XM8. Originally, we had the Objective Infantry Combat Weapon, which was going to be the OICW, which was going to be a combination of an explosive weapon and a kinetic weapon, they called it. So it was a grenade launcher, a semi-auto grenade launcher actually, magazine fed, and a carbine. And they had this thing, you've probably seen pictures of it, I'll put one up if you haven't. It's this massive, gargantuan thing, very heavy, very bulky, and it could fire semi-auto grenades or 5.56 ammo, all sorts of computerized stuff built in. It would have smart grenades and such. It didn't work. It was too heavy. It was too bulky. It was a bad idea. So what they did was they tried to take some elements from the objective program and use them individually. And there were one or two that actually may have some legs and we may see in use eventually. Again, Weapons Man article can tell you more about that. When they took the carbine element off of the OICW, that became the XM8 as a standalone rifle. And the problem is, well, it always had some issues. The famous one is it had some problems with the handguards overheating, which you will sometimes see people blow completely out of proportion as into the gun melts, which it doesn't. But the problem is it didn't do any better than the M4, M16 platform. If you're going to spend a lot of money to replace all of the small arms in U.S. military inventory, it really has to do the job better than what you've already got. And it really has to do the job a lot better than what you've got. The arbitrary decision when they went into the objective program was that they wanted guns that were 100% more effective than what was currently in the inventory. So something that was literally and somehow measurably twice as good as the M16. What they ended up with was something that in testing, often as not, came out a little bit below the M16. So could that potentially be a good gun? Sure. But the XM8 is a new development. The M16 has been tweaked and perfected for literally decades, more than half a century now, actually. And it's, without some fundamental change in technology, it's really hard to see how something like the XM8 could ever conceivably be better than the M16. And it wasn't. And that's why the Army ultimately scrapped it. By the way, it was 2005 when they finally pulled the plug on the program. And in fact, part of the reason that they pulled the plug was they were starting to get combat feedback from U.S. combat activity in the Middle East, and they wanted, the official reasoning is, they wanted to go back and be able to incorporate those lessons into their requirements for the next generation of weapons. And that turned into, well, you know what we've got now is really working fine, and no one's been able to come up with anything that works a lot better, so we'll stick with what we've got. All right, next up, Ian Hutchison asks, why did so many Japanese Type I rifles remain unused even when Japan was reduced to producing increasingly crude last-ditch rifles of their own? So a little background for you guys who aren't familiar, the Type I is actually an Italian Carcano built under contract for the Japanese Navy. They show up out there. They're actually not that expensive because who is interested in a rifle that is both Italian and Japanese? Very few people. And what's kind of interesting about them is a lot of them are in pristine condition because a lot of them were actually captured in warehouses unissued, which as Ian Hutchison suggests, is kind of odd when you consider what the Japanese were doing for armament late in the war everywhere else. So I have a two-part answer, which isn't really a complete answer. First part is a lot of Type Is were, in fact, used. There are a lot of them out there that I've seen direct reference to that were captured by U.S. GIs in various combat zones in the Pacific. They were definitely used. The other part of this is that this was a rifle used by and issued to the Japanese Navy. Now, the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy were run separately. They didn't really coordinate or cooperate a lot, and they had separate arms procurement programs. So the last-ditch substitute standard Type 99 Arisakas that the Army was making weren't available to the Navy. Same sort of situation. The Navy contracts with Italians to make these Carcanos. They're sort of a Carcano action, but they're in 6.5 Japanese. Anyway, these were made for the Japanese Navy, so they were not available to the Army. And apparently there was a substantial amount of inter-service rivalry, and if the Navy had some spare guns and the Army needed guns, that doesn't really make it very likely that the Navy was just going to give them over. So now the Navy had ground forces. The Special Naval Landing Force, which is kind of like Japanese Marine Corps, was one of them, but there were other units. They did use some Type Is, and I suspect what was going on was that the guns that were warehoused were probably being held for an intended heroic last attack, where they would want to have good quality, ready, brand new weapons to issue to make the how do I want to put it, this final decisive attack that would push the Americans back, something like that. They were probably holding on to this warehouse of Type Is for that. That, of course, never came. The guns got captured and sold to us, and America ended up with most of them after all. Let's see. Jeremy Wagner says, when firing a 1911 with the original style of grip safety, sometimes it will leave a small bruise on the web of the hand. This is sometimes called hammer bite and does not seem to be a problem with the beaver tail grip safety. It seems unlikely to me that the hammer actually comes into contact with the hand. Would a high-speed video comparison of the GI grip safety and the beaver tail grip safety show the difference between the two? It would. Definitely would, Jeremy. I have not done a comparison like that. However, I do actually have some high-speed video from shooting a Star Model B, which, for all practical purposes in this situation, is a 1911 with a short GI-style beaver tail, or a grip safety. And what's actually happening, some people may get a bruise. The hammer does, in fact, contact your hand. It whacks your hand good. What happens to me, at least, is the hammer actually pinches a little bit of skin between the hammer and the grip safety. And this happens if you have a high and tight grip on the gun, which is something that a lot of people specifically try to do in order to help control recoil and maintain a fast follow-up shot. Definitely happens. You can see the high speed here of it happening to me. It's not the greatest video, but I think it gets the point across. So yes, that definitely happens. I don't think it was that big of a deal to the military. They did extend the grip safety in the 1911A1 compared to the original 1911. That reduced the problem a bit. In commercial guns today, if you're looking for that two-handed, very high, bring your hand up as close to the bore axis as you can sort of grip, I would definitely recommend getting one of those extended beaver tail grip safeties, and that will prevent the problem entirely. All right, next up, I actually have two questions here that I am combining into one answer. Darby Metcalf asks what my personal collection looks like. What do I look for when I'm buying a new gun? Would I mind showing you a few of my favorite guns and why they're my favorites? And Daryl Messaros says, Ian, I'm curious to know what the oldest firearm you own is and also the newest one. So we'll start with the oldest gun I own is a French Chassepot needle rifle, 1860s production. I believe it's 1868 specifically. And the newest firearm I own is a Ruger precision rifle, which dates to 2016. It's like 2 months old. So I think that spans it gap pretty well. In my own collecting, I kind of have an arbitrary decision if I stick to just cartridge firearms. And I consider the Chassepot close enough. It's not a metallic cartridge, but it is a paper cartridge. So I'm not getting into flintlocks. I'm not really getting into percussion guns. I kind of stay a little more modern than that. Partly because I find that more interesting, and partly just as an arbitrary way to limit the number of things that I'm potentially tempted to buy. So I did pull out a few of my other guns to show you over here. What does my collection in general look like? It's kind of a weird amalgamation of what I find affordable and interesting simultaneously. My interests ebb and flow between various things, so it's always growing in odd directions. Alright, so let's take a look at a couple specific pieces. So this guy is a French M16 Berthier, post-World War I production gun. These were used by the French military for quite some time. This is in the collection for a couple reasons. First off, I really kind of like French firearms. They get a bad rap in a lot of ways, and I think they're very interesting. The French have kind of been at the forefront of a lot of firearms development technology. Now, this particular one I have because it has some decorative artwork sort of fixed onto the buttstock here. Now, I cannot prove what this is. You know, if I were selling this and someone wanted to buy it and they asked for my provenance and proof, I got none. However, I'm not looking to sell it, and I'm effectively convinced for my own purposes that this is, in fact, added by the French resistance. This is a symbol used by the Vercors, a French resistance militia. I'm pretty sure it's legit. The rest of the rifle kind of has the right smell to it, for lack of a better term. And it wasn't being sold as something valuable and rare. So I think that's really cool. I really like little side notes of history like that. And anybody resisting the Nazis is pretty cool too. So that's why I've got this one. I also have an interest in Japanese firearms, which dates, is due in part to my father spending a long time collecting them. But once again, I find them interesting. In a lot of ways, they were far enough removed from Europe that they often had an interesting perspective. Not always for the better, but Japanese guns are often a little bit different than what you find other places, and that's kind of cool. Now, this particular one is another example of something that was modified. It looks like a sporterized Type 38 carbine, which it sort of is. However, this was modified by the Thai Army. And after World War II, the US government provided Thailand, formerly Siam, with a whole ton of M1 carbines as military aid. But they didn't give them enough carbines to arm everybody that the Thais wanted to arm. So since they had access to a whole bunch of leftover Japanese firearms, the Thai arsenals took a bunch of Type 38 carbines, cut the stocks down, ground them out back here, fitted them with M1 carbine slings. This is the same basic length and overall pattern as an M1 carbine, and it's a really handy little carbine. Chambered for the 6.5 Arisaka 6.5 Japanese cartridge. Really cool little gun. Now there is actually a second version of this that I don't have yet, which is sort of different only in a really nerdy collector sort of sense. This is an army version. There's also a police version. So eventually I may find one of those as well. But another interesting, a good representation of the sort of thing I find interesting. And lastly is one that I just picked up fairly recently. This is a good example of the really weird mechanical Rube Goldberg stuff that I find really cool. This is an Alof's shotgun conversion, and I'll be doing a full video on this before too much longer. It is basically just your standard ordinary 12-gauge break-action shotgun, but it has this thing bolted onto the side, which converts it into a 4-round repeating shotgun. So it's almost semi-auto, but not quite, with really the shotgun version of a Rube Goldberg mousetrap on the side. So stay tuned, because there will be some really cool footage of this coming up in probably a couple weeks. All right, next question. PHP asks, During the US ACR, Advanced Combat Rifle, program in the 90s, some of the weapons used flechet ammo instead of traditional bullets. What were the pros and cons of such types of ammunition? So for those of you who aren't familiar, a flechet is basically a very small dart or arrow. Typically in military context, you're looking at something that is 1 to maybe 2 inches long. It's going to have some small fins on the back and a very pointy tip at the front. And they were used in a couple of military contexts. One is in shotguns, where the idea is you would replace buckshot, and they thought maybe it'd be more effective. The other, and I think, where PHP is getting at here, is they did also experiment with using flechettes in rifles, which kind of blurs the term rifle, but we'll ignore that. They've been used both in, first of all, they've been used in experiments for a couple decades. In some cases, you're talking about one rather large flechet replacing the bullet in a cartridge, and in that case, you typically have a discarding sabot around it so that it fits the bore. They also have tried using multiple flechettes in a single cartridge. The idea there is by firing multiple projectiles at once, you have a better chance of getting a single hit, because you're putting a pattern onto the target instead of just one projectile. And the reason you would use flechettes in that is because the theory is those little fins will help them be more accurate at range, where if you tried to use multiple projectiles, either you're going to stack up bullets in a cartridge so that they can all engage the rifling, or you're going to be firing some sort of subcaliber shot, something like that, which isn't going to engage the rifling at all, which is going to have problems with accuracy. As it turns out, one of the problems with flechettes is that they really aren't all that accurate. Not in comparison to a bullet, because they aren't rifled and they aren't spinning. The other problems tend to be barrier penetration is very poor. It doesn't take much at all to throw flechettes off course. The wounding potential of the flechettes was fairly poor, not nearly as good as a bullet. They don't penetrate very well at all. They tend to turn, and then because the individual flechettes are extremely lightweight, once they, you think of a bullet turning and tumbling, and that's, wow, that's a really effective bullet, it does nasty stuff. A flechet is so light that once it turns, it's got very little mass and very little inertia, and it just stops. So they don't tend to produce deep or wounds that are as significant as a traditional bullet. So between problems with lethality, problems with accuracy, and problems with barrier penetration, they didn't work out. All right, next up, Martin Meyer asks, do I plan on making any more gunsmithing videos? I have done a handful of them. They're mostly over on the gunlab.net YouTube channel, which is from several years ago. Unfortunately, no, I don't plan to do any more of those. I was never more than an amateur gunsmith at best, and I am no longer really in a position, well, when I made those videos, I was in a position where I was a very short walk away from a nice shop full of lathes and mills and all sorts of really cool gunsmithing tools, and it was easy to set up and do that kind of work. I am no longer in that position, spending much more of my time doing research and filming videos on oddball guns, and frankly, I'm better at that. I enjoy it more, and so I will be leaving gunsmithing to people who are more gifted at gunsmithing than I am. All right, Schuldig says, if you had a chance to design your own gun, rifle, pistol, choose what you like most, what features do you want to put in the gun? Delayed blowback, folding stock, flip-up iron sights, wood grips, etc., and why? Greetings from Austria. Thanks for writing from Austria, Schuldig. The problem with this question, and I get variants on this question a lot, what people will often say is, have I designed my own gun? Because having seen a lot of them, I must be in a position to be really good at designing a new one. The problem is, well, I don't consider myself to be in a position to design a new gun, mainly because I think we've largely hit a technological plateau. I don't think there is a whole lot more out there without some fundamental changes in the firearms technology. I'm not sure there's a whole lot to be developed that hasn't already been developed. What we are doing with firearms development right now, in my opinion, is tweaking that last couple percent of efficiency out of the systems that we've been working on for 50 or 100 years. So having seen a lot of the weird stuff in the past doesn't really put me in a better position to tweak that last couple percent out like that. So Now the other issue is, if I was designing my own gun, what features would I use? Well, that entirely depends on what the gun was for. There is no best gun, far from it. Everything, the quality, how good a gun is, entirely depends on what you're trying to use it for. So if I'm trying to design a pellet rifle to shoot rabbits for eating, I'm going to come up with something totally different than if I'm designing a shotgun for security police to use, or a heavy machine gun to shoot at low-flying aircraft for the military, or a concealed carry handgun for ordinary folks to carry. If you want to figure out what features are best in a gun, you first have to define what the purpose of the gun is. So there are times when two totally opposite features could both be the best option for totally different applications. High magnification scope is great on a 1,000-yard precision rifle, and it's terrible on a concealed carry pistol, for the same reason that a big 8 MOA red dot is great on a concealed carry pistol, and it's pretty terrible on a long-range precision rifle. So I can't really answer the question without saying, well, what am I designing a gun to do? Alright, so Lars Telg asks, so what would be your choice of weapons available during World War I? I know that C and Arsenal will probably have an answer coming. Well, I would be curious to hear C and Arsenal's answer. This may stem from a previous question I got about what gun would I take into World War I, where I said an AR-15. Lars is specifically limiting the choices here to things that were actually available during World War I. And if it comes to firearms in general, I think my choice would be a Madsen light machine gun. I think those are a substantially more advanced gun than most of the competitors that were available at the time. I have shot them both semi-auto and full auto, and I really like them. I think it's a very effective design, especially for its time period. And if you gave me the option of anything in World War I, that's probably what I would take. If you limited it to just the infantry rifles, then it gets tougher. Honestly, probably a Mauser carbine. I don't consider them in any way the most interesting of the guns, but I think they are probably the best combination of handy to carry, robust, and accurate. It'd be cooler to carry any number of other things. It'd be cool to carry one of the early Berthier carbines, but the Mauser is mechanically a more reliable and better gun, unfortunately. All right, Colby Gillette says, what is your opinion of the Ruger 1022? I have done some shooting with a 1022, not recently. I think it's a great little gun. In fact, the reason I am answering this question is to expand on that and mention, when you think about it, how really impressive of a gun company Ruger actually is. Nothing that Ruger's ever produced has been like, wow, that's exciting and cool. I really want that new Ruger gun. And yet, Ruger has kind of managed to consistently produce this line of effective, reliable, affordable, really well thought out, good guns. Obviously, the Ruger Mark I and Mark II pistols are still in heavy use. They're very good guns. The 1022 is a great little rifle that, it's one of those guns, or one of those consumer products that has become so popular and mainstream that you can build an entire 1022 without using a single Ruger part. Literally everything down to the receiver is available aftermarket. Kind of like Jeeps. You could go build a Jeep without using any parts made by Jeep or any of its parent companies. It's got to be a good gun at that point, honestly. Ruger pistols, even the old, like the Ruger P85, P90 series, were they really sexy looking? No, but they pretty much worked and they were pretty affordable. The Ruger American seems to be a good pistol. The Ruger Precision Rifle I have very high hopes for. I've got one over in the rifle rack that I'm waiting on a scope for, and I'm very excited to do some shooting with it. Ruger just keeps cranking out solid ideas. They're not exciting, but they work well. And that's kind of an impressive feat for a gun company when you consider how many other companies kind of alternate between really good and kind of terrible stuff. Props to Ruger. They didn't pay me to say that either. All right, next up, Robert Drumontanis, I think, says, as far as I know, Britain was the only major participant in World War II that still had a revolver as their main issued sidearm. Why might this be? And the answer is money. The answer is very often money when you have questions about why did country X field gun Y. Now, I think, Robert, you have a little bit of a misconception about the state of a lot of military sidearms. Britain did use the Browning high power during World War II, as well as their Enfield and Webley revolvers. And pretty much everybody in World War II had a combination of both revolvers and semi-auto pistols. Kind of with the exception of Germany, actually. Germany had transitioned to the Luger very early, so the Reichs revolvers probably saw some Volkssturm use at the end of World War II, but Germany really had all semi-autos during World War II. They had Lugers, and then they were transitioning to P-38s. Everybody else typically had been, they'd been using revolvers, and they were in the process of transitioning to semi-auto pistols. And nobody really spent a lot of money to, when they adopted a semi-auto, to immediately replace all of the revolvers in service with semi-autos, because it's just expensive, and the handguns are not that important of a firearm or a piece of equipment for the military that why would you bother dumping all the money into that when there are more important things? So let's see a few examples. The Russians used a lot of Nagant revolvers as well as Tokarev pistols. The Americans were still using revolvers, 1917 pattern revolvers, as well as 1911 semi-autos. The French had their 1892 pattern revolvers. They probably still had rubies, as well as the 1935 pistols. The British, of course, we touched on. Germans, the Italians were using Bodeo revolvers that were holdovers, as well as Beretta semi-auto pistols, most significantly the 1934 and 1935 pistols. Pretty much everybody, they would have procured a bunch of semi-autos for the most important people before the war started. Once the war kicks in, now we need a lot more handguns, so we're gonna kick up production of the semi-autos, but we're also gonna start pulling all of the old revolvers out of storage and issue them as we need them, and maybe even go back into producing more of the revolvers because they may be cheaper to make than the semi-autos. All right, so Nathan asks, were there any attempts to have a semi-auto or full-auto device using black powder cartridges? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Most of them we probably don't know about because they failed quickly and dramatically. However, there were a few that were actually reasonably successful. Most significantly, the very first Maxim guns for a couple of years were actually black powder cartridge guns. And the black powder was one of the problems with them that Maxim was able to fix or resolve with the development of smokeless powder. Really, the transition from black powder to smokeless powder was what allowed people to develop effective semi and full automatic guns in the first place. So people were constantly trying this before, but they were never able to really make it work, with a few exceptions like Maxim. Ferdinand Mannlicher also had a semi-auto black powder rifle that he developed. He only made 1 or 2 prototypes of it. And of course, it worked, but not for very long because it would get full of black powder fouling and seize up. That's kind of what all of them did. All right, next question. Krydecki, I think, asks, are there any general advantages and disadvantages of tilting versus rotating bolt locking systems? Why would a designer choose one over the other? Well, speaking generically, especially if you're talking about a multi-lug rotating bolt like an AR-15, the advantage you get there is accuracy. Because you have more locking lugs, which are all machined to be exactly meshed with each other, you are getting a more repeatable lockup every time when the bolt closes and it fires, and that makes the gun more accurate because the fewer variables you can have with each shot, the better your accuracy. Now the downside is that's not really an easy system to replace the locking lugs. Not necessarily an issue when you've got an AR-15 and you can just pull the barrel off and replace the barrel entirely. However, when you're talking about something like a supporting fire machine gun, the advantage you can get from a tilting bolt is that you've only got one locking surface and it's generally going to be at the very back of the bolt, and you can design a firearm where that locking surface is very easily replaceable. So that if you put 50,000 rounds through the gun, and your headspace is starting to grow towards the point of being dangerous, you can simply pull out a screwdriver, take out the locking shoulder, put in a new one that's just slightly larger, and presto, the gun's back in service. That's really one of the big advantages of the tilting bolt systems. You'll see that in the Bren gun, for example. You'll also see it in the FAL. You have replaceable locking shoulders. And the downside is typically with the tilting bolt, your accuracy is not as good because you've only got one locking surface and it's not necessarily as precisely repeatable as something like the multiple surfaces on an AR-15 rotating bolt. That is, by the way, a gross generalization, and I suspect that people are already coming up with counterexamples, which are probably valid. The M1 Garand is a rotating bolt system, but not necessarily all that accurate. Can be made accurate, but and the reason there is largely that you've only got two locking surfaces instead of 6, 7, 8, like you can find on other designs. All right. Arashi Toha, I think, says, it appears that the limits of the brass cartridge case revolve around the pressure at which brass flows. Were there any early attempts to substitute different case materials to allow for higher pressure cartridges in small arms? Sort of. It's actually the opposite. Brass was not the first material that was used, and in fact some of the early cartridges are substantially weaker than what we use today. So the first cartridges that were used were actually steel, and they were usually pretty darn thick steel, where pressure was not the issue. You'll see these on the very early Gatling guns. The Agar or Agar Union repeating gun used these. I have done a couple videos on Roper revolving shotguns, which use this type of steel cartridge case, sort of. And these are all black powder guns. And the way they worked was what we're calling the cartridge was actually kind of an interchangeable chamber for the gun. So you'd have a big chunk of steel that would fit into the barrel, and you could pour powder in it and load a projectile into it and wadding and tamp it down and secure it. And then you'd put a percussion cap on the back of it on a firing nipple, like on a cap and ball revolver. And you'd make a whole bunch of these, and then you could use them as individual cartridges. And after you fired them, they'd come out of the gun one way or another, and you could then go back and reload them and use them again. The critical difference between one of those and a cartridge like we know it today is that those didn't provide a gas seal, or they didn't provide a very good gas seal. The benefit that we get from using brass, and the reason that we don't make it a lot thicker to compensate for allowing us to use much higher pressure, is that we depend on the brass actually stretching under pressure when the gun fires and creating a gas-tight seal at the back end of the gun. That's the only thing that prevents a bunch of this propellant gas from spitting out the back of the gun into your face. And that was one of the problems with these early cartridges is, in fact, some of the first centerfire cartridges designed by a guy named Pauly were made of a very thick brass that was thick enough that it didn't expand and seal. And by the way, the term for that is obturate. So these early cartridges didn't have that obturating effect, and so they would leak gas out the back of the action of the gun. And then, after it was discovered that, if we make this thinner and we use a more pliable material, we can fix the gas leaking issue. The problem then became developing the industrial technology to make a brass case that was the right combination of thick to sustain pressure and also thin to expand and create a gas seal. So some of the early cartridges were what are called balloon head, where they actually machined a case head, and then you would, one way or another, actually attach like a foil body. If you look at, for example, some old British Martini Henry ammo, you can see that it's actually like wrapped foil, and where there's a neck in the cartridge, this brass is actually kind of crimped and folded together. And you look at that and you really have to have some second thoughts about pulling the trigger on it, knowing how fragile that brass has to be. That sort of stuff was really not reusable. Could be recycled maybe, but you're not reloading those things. They are too wimpy. So there was also use of copper Copper isn't as good at this sort of thing as brass, so that didn't last very long. Today we use steel cases again because we've tweaked the alloy and the thicknesses to be correct to give us that gas seal. So, and historically people have also used steel when brass was at a premium, often during wartime. There's a lot of other stuff that people need to be doing with brass, and so instead of use it up in cartridges that are going to get thrown away, they'll use steel instead. So, let's see, next question here. Stuart Burton says, which 19th century single-shot cartridge breechloader would you call the best overall, taking into account ease of loading, power, cost, and accuracy? 19th century breechloaders, I'm sure I'm missing a few in my general experience, but if you force me to pick one, I am probably going to go with the Remington rolling block. Could be chambered in basically anything. They were made in both smokeless and black powder cartridges over their lifespan. Perfectly capable of using some reasonably heavy smokeless powder cartridges. Fill that role well enough. And then in terms of ease of use and cost, they were certainly good enough on both counts to become just vastly popular military arms. They weren't used by any of the first-line major nations, but when it came to smaller countries that didn't have their own indigenous arms production, a remarkable number of them used the Remington rolling block during that period from like the 1870s to the late 1890s, when the single-shot breech-loading cartridge gun was the standard in military technology. So, yeah, and then ease of loading. The Remington rolling block is an extremely well thought out, efficient, effective design. It's simple, it's easy to use, it's not liable to have very many problems. The reason that we didn't use them here in the US is because we had a whole lot of muskets lying around, and the military wanted to save money by using the existing guns and converting them to breech loading systems. Hence, we ended up with the Trapdoor Springfield. The rolling block did compete in US military trials, and it's kind of a better gun than the Trapdoor in many ways, except that because it can't be made out of an existing musket, it wasn't cheap enough, or it wasn't expected to be cheap enough. All right, Stephen Galligan says, did any muskets or black powder rifles use a revolving cylinder or similar system that allowed them multiple shots before a reload? The answer is yes, and there are actually several different systems that were used. People were fairly creative about this sort of thing. So the first off is a revolving rifle, which, yep, absolutely. In fact, the U.S. military adopted the Colt 1855 revolving rifle for cavalry use for a time. There were a bunch of other revolving rifle designs out there that were used, so that's one way you can get multiple shots on a muzzle-loading black powder gun. Another system that was used was actually to have two barrels and two locks on one revolving pivot. So you basically have one stock and trigger mechanism, and then two barrels and two firing mechanisms. So what you could do is fire one round, and then you would hit a latch and rotate the whole barrel assembly 180 degrees, and you'd have a second barrel with its own sights and its own action, whether it be a percussion action or a flintlock action or a wheel lock action, and presto, there you've got a second shot. Those were made both as rifles and as pistols. And then you also have superposed charges, where you would have, if this, well, let's say it's a flintlock, where I've seen a couple examples of these. You would have multiple locks on the gun, so multiple, the pan, the frizzen, the lock, the flint, everything, multiple sets of those, and each one would have its own touch hole going into the barrel, and you would load powder and a ball, and then more powder and another ball, and more powder and another ball, and I think the most I've ever seen in one of those is 8, and you load them all up, and then you fire them sequentially from the one at the front, working your way towards the back. And if it was a well thought out design, it would have some sort of interrupter safety mechanism so that you could not fire the one in the back before you'd fired the one in the front, because that would cause a lot of pressure and make the gun explode. But these superposed charges were another way to get multiple shots out of a muzzleloader before you had to reload it. Psy, QSY, not sure how exactly to pronounce that, says, why is it that metallic cartridges took such a long time to make it to the military? The technology was available on the civilian market since the 1810s or 1820s with brass and cardboard pinfire cartridges, yet to my knowledge no military rifle using metallic cartridges was adopted before the Whitworth conversion in 1853 and the before the 1850s. The answer is early cartridges were not up to the standards of military durability. So in order for something to be adopted by the military, it has to be pretty rugged, pretty dependable, and pretty idiot-proof. In fact, this is one area where we can go back to the objective infantry combat weapon. That stuff a lot of it looked really good on a Defense Department PowerPoint presentation, but when you took the prototypes and considered putting them in the hands of a whole bunch of newly recruited privates, you'd get a shiver down your spine at what would happen. The same thing kind of goes with some of the very early cartridges, metallic cartridges. They didn't gas seal very well. They may have been fragile. They may have been liable to crack and get stuck on firing. They may not have been very waterproof. They may have been set up for guns that were kind of kludges, kind of hodgepodges, not really ready for military ruggedness requirements. And it took a while before the technology was developed sufficiently that it was suitable for military use. You know, if you're a sportsman, if you've got, say, an early pinfire shotgun, and one of the barrels, you get a shell stuck in one of the barrels, well, it's not really that big a deal. You got a second barrel. Worst case, your hunting trip gets ruined for the day. You have to go back, give the gun to a gunsmith, and get it fixed. Civilians are willing to buy products that are kind of on the bleeding edge of technology and deal with those kind of problems because it's really not a big deal. People like having the brand new fancy stuff, and most of the time it'll work right. With a military, you've kind of got the opposite requirement. Militaries are generally much more interested in staying one generation back in the old technology that they know well, that everyone's trained to use, that we understand, that we already have spare parts for, and that it's a known quantity. Even if there's something newer around the corner, we're going to be careful before we adopt something new, because what they don't want to do is go out there, spend a whole ton of money, equip a bunch of people with a new weapon, and then discover, oh, well, if it's raining out, you can't use that. Geez, didn't we tell you it doesn't work in the rain? That kind of problem. So, yeah, 50 years to get military cartridges after civilian cartridges, and honestly, that seems about right. Think about the time frame between when self-loading rifles, semi-auto rifles, became available on the civilian market, which would have been right around 1900, to when they were in common use with militaries. Well, the U.S. was the first one significantly in 1936. Yeah, that's 35, 36 years for that technology to go from perfectly adequate for the civilian market to just barely good enough for the military. Alrighty, next up, Vince Jondernoa says, you may have touched on this in the past, but what are your thoughts on 3D printed firearms? Well, couple things. First off, with 3D printed polymer firearms, I think they're an interesting experiment. I don't think they're ever going to be very significant, because while people are powering through and doing some impressive things with them, you're never going to overcome the problem of holding pressure in a polymer part. That's just not within the mechanical capabilities of the polymers. So I think they're an interesting experiment in that way, and they're never going to go anywhere. However, metal 3D printing is advancing more and more, and I don't think it will be that many more years before we have 3D metal printing that's available on the consumer or maybe the prosumer level. Once people can 3D print metal items, then I think we're going to see some very interesting developments. On the one hand, I think we'll see some very interesting things in reproducing obsolete, very obscure guns, the sort of things that I'm really interested in, because 3D printing those parts can make them much more economical to make than if you were machining them on traditional tools. I think we will also see some people figuring out how to use the capability of 3D printing, namely being able to create features that you can't do with traditional machinery. I think people will figure out how to use that to new and interesting ends in firearms design. So, in fact, I think this is an interesting enough topic that, with any luck, my buddy Carl Casarda and I will actually be presenting a talk on this at DEFCON this coming summer. So that'll be very cool. If you are planning to be at DEFCON, you'll definitely want to keep an eye out for that presentation. If you're not, well, I have no doubt it will be published on the web not that long after it's given. All right, almost done here. I've got 2 more for today. The next one is Zachary. We'll just go with Zachary. Says, which last-ditch or emergency production weapon would you pick to produce if the need arose? Ooh, pick to produce is interesting. If I were to pick one to produce in my own facilities, I would be screwed because I don't have any manufacturing facilities to speak of beyond basically a Dremel tool. If I were to choose which one of these I would want to actually use, if you said, you only get to pick from the last-ditch guns, but you have to pick a gun that you're going to go fight for your life with, probably a pretty decent chance I'd take an Arisaka. Even the last-ditch Arisakas were pretty darn good guns. They sacrificed a lot of the aesthetics. They didn't sacrifice the mechanical setup, and I like the Arisaka. It's a nice, efficient, clean, well-thought-out, well-designed gun. The Arisaka committee took some of the best ideas that were around at the time and put them together into a very nice bolt-action rifle. I think I would rather have that than a last-ditch German Mauser. All right, last question for this video. Zwijneveld, which I probably butchered, asks, when will you be visiting Europe and what would you like to see there? Well, that depends. To a large extent, that depends on Patreon. The support from you guys on Patreon is, as I've said, what allows me to spend all of my time doing this instead of having to have any other side occupation. And if I've put a goal on Patreon of $5,000 a month as a threshold where I can actually start making some regular trips to Europe. It's an expensive thing to do. The airfare, the lodging, eating in Europe, everything. I have nice infrastructure here with a house where I live, but you have to pay for everything on a daily basis when you're traveling like that. There are a whole bunch of things I would like to see in Europe. There are a bunch of large arms factories, which some I've investigated, some I haven't, may or may not still exist, but I know there are some really good factory collections. I would love to see some of the collections from the French Saint-Étienne arsenal. I'm not sure exactly where they are today, but I would really like to be in a position to find out and be able to go look at them. I have been to the pattern room in England before, and I can't wait to go back again. There is so much cool stuff there to show you guys that I could run the video channel from the pattern room for years without running out of material and have a good time doing it. There are a number of big museums in Germany. There are museums and gun collections pretty much everywhere. So, and especially some of the smaller countries. I would love to see the Dutch Military Museum, for example. They have a really cool collection of unusual prototype and experimental guns that would be cool to see. Unfortunately, I'm going to be leaving out a bunch of people here because there are simply too many places to list. Once I am financially able to start traveling into Europe, I think we'll be able to bring you guys a bunch more really cool stuff in the areas that, where things just didn't get back into the U.S. A lot of what we have here comes from American soldiers who brought things back as war trophies, and there's a lot of developmental stuff that was never in a position to be taken as a war trophy, and so never ended up in the United States. And a lot of that is what I would like to see, and what I'll be able to, hopefully. So, thank you guys for supporting me through Patreon and making all of this possible. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll do another one of these next month. Thanks for watching.